It's time to take a step beyond. The podcast to inspire creativity and imagination. Here's your host, Dr. Anthony Poston.
Thanks for tuning in to A Step Beyond. So in my book, A 250,000 Steps, I apply some of the leadership lessons learned during the Apollo Moon program in the 60s. I've had the fortunate opportunity to get to know a number of the Apollo astronauts over the years and have had some very meaningful conversations with them. One of those astronauts graciously wrote the foreword for this book, my book, and it's someone who I would not only consider a colleague, but also a very dear friend. He's an engineer, a former test pilot for the instructor for the United States Air Force. However, his most memorable role in life was that of the command module pilot for Apollo 15. Ladies and gentlemen, my age-defying good friend, Al Worden. Al, welcome to the show.
Age-defying, huh?
You are, my friend. You are very age-defying compared to your colleagues.
Well, that's what the girls say, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. All right, so by the way, I just said your most memorable role was having gone to the moon, but now I'm certain you can say it's having been a guest on my podcast because, you know, we all know that everything pales in comparison to my podcast.
Well, it's certainly the latest, I got to say that.
Yeah, no doubt. All right,
okay.
so Al,
Yeah.
I know some people are probably wondering, what is the command module pilot? I think when people in general hear that someone went to the moon, they just assume, hey, they also walked on it. But that's not the case because someone had to make sure you all got back safely. Talk a bit about your role and why it was so important.
Okay. Command module pilots do 95% of the flying. They are responsible for the command service module, which is the combined vehicles that take the lunar module to the moon, stays in lunar orbit while the lunar module's on the surface, and then when the guys come back up in lunar orbit, they collect them and bring them back home. So the command module pilot, in fact, I have to laugh about it because everybody talks about those who walked on the moon. There are 12 guys who walked on the moon. But a much more select group were the command module pilots because only 6 of them. And there are not too many of us left now with Dick Gordon passing the other day.
Yeah, that was very, very sad.
Yep. So anyway, I guess the point is that the command module pilot, to make a landing on the moon, you got to have 3 guys. You got to have a guy flying the vehicle, like me flying the command module, and Dave Scott flying the lunar module, and then Jim Irwin was the guy who looked over our shoulder to make sure that everything was okay, all the instruments were okay, and all that kind of thing. So the 2 guys who did the flying on the flight were myself and Dave Scott. I flew them out there, Dave flew the lunar module down to the surface and back up again, and then I flew them all back home. So it was pretty critical, and a command module pilot is the only one on the flight who is authorized to fly by himself. In every other instance, every other second of the flight, there are at least 2 guys watching a maneuver.
So unlike prior missions where, you know, let's face it, they were pretty much all about let's just get there and get back safely, yours was the first that was focused heavily on science. In fact, all of you were taught to be geologists and how to observe and describe what you saw. So do us a favor, Al, describe the moon to us.
Okay, well, let me put it in 2 pieces. There are 2 kinds of geology that we trained on for the flight. Dave and Jim trained on what I'll call microbiology. They were looking at stuff that was at their feet, 6 feet away, or across the field, or, down into a rill, which is a collapsed lava tube, that kind of thing. And their objective was to pick up as many rocks as they could, particularly any rocks with a different color. And in fact, Jim found a rock that had a crystalline structure in it, which has been called the Genesis rock, which is maybe or maybe not true. So they were looking at the small stuff. They were looking at pieces of lunar terrain that they could pick up. My job was to look at the large features on the moon and make some kind of determination between whether these features are volcanic in nature or meteor impact in nature. So I trained exclusively on how to distinguish between the 2, and that's what I did for 6 days and 3 days by myself. I did a lot of visual observations, and in fact, some of my observations became quite important because I did see a field of syndicals, which had never been seen before, in the Taurus Littoral area, and I took high-resolution pictures of that area. And when that information was all analyzed back in Mission Control, it was important enough that they actually changed the landing site for Apollo 17 to send it to that area.
So describe it to us. I mean, you saw it up close. So what does the moon look like up close?
Well, the moon is, it depends on which way you're looking at it. If you're looking towards the sun, it's kind of a grayish color. If you're looking away from the sun, it's kind of a brownish color. The dark circles we see on the face of the moon from here are all meteor impact basins, and they're huge. They're like 500 miles across. There are lots and lots of smaller craters, and of course, where our landing site was Hadley Rill, which was a volcanic area where the lava flow down the hill from Mount Hadley actually carved out a trench in the lunar surface, and so therefore we see a linear feature. One of the things that distinguishes a meteor crater from a volcanic area is that in a volcanic area, if there is a lava flowing, then you get rather linear features. Meteor crater is only circular, but a volcano that's flowing lava will form linear features on the surface of the moon. So that's how you distinguish the two. On the back side of the moon, you don't see any of that. And that's because all the meteors struck the moon probably at the same time, all on one side of the moon, which did some great things to the makeup of the moon, for instance, shifting the center of gravity away from the center of the moon, which makes the moon look at the Earth with only one face all the time.
So when you first saw it, how did you feel?
Well, we went into the moon backwards. We never did see it as we were approaching it, and that's because we had to slow down once we got behind the moon to stay in lunar orbit. Otherwise, we do what we call a figure eight, and we come back to Earth, just like Apollo 13 did. And Apollo 8 didn't. Apollo 8 actually went into lunar orbit, but Apollo 13 circled the moon and came back home they never did slow down. Had to slow down about 3,000 miles an hour to stay in the lunar orbit. So to do that, we had to fire the surface propulsion engine, which we had to put in front of us, firing forward so that we would slow down. So we never saw the moon. When the engine stopped firing, we turned around and looked down at the moon, and we were just coming into the sunlit part of the backside of the moon, and it was pretty awesome sight because all you saw were lots and lots of small craters and little upland area, and not much of anything. It all looked kind of the same. It was kind of like taking a small patch of the great western desert in the States and multiplying that over the whole surface. Just a whole series of small craters.
You talk about the flight there and how you had to slow down. So when you go to a museum and you look at one of the very few command modules that are in museums, and people don't understand this, but just for our listeners, virtually every part of the Saturn V rocket, which was massive piece of machinery, every part of it either burned up and coming back into the atmosphere or it crashed on the moon. So all that was ever left was the command module, that which you splashed down in. When you go to a museum and you see one of these things, it's tiny. It's like a little Fiat. And 3 of you had to live in that capsule for about 2 weeks. So talk about what that was like.
Well, there were different crews approached all that differently. Apollo 12, Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Al Bean, they were all great, great buddies. They were like brothers. If you saw one, you saw all 3 of them. They were always together. We did things differently. I kind of trained on my own because what I needed to do didn't involve Dave and Jim. And what they didn't involve me. I didn't go down the lunar surface. So we kind of trained separately. I would say we were okay professionally. We were a great crew professionally. Dave was a fantastic commander, but we were not all that friendly with each other, especially between Dave and myself. We didn't we didn't socialize very much. I mean, there were times when we had to, but we're kind of our own independent person. Now, living in a spacecraft the size of a Volkswagen Beetle is a little bit tough for 4.5 days, and that's why I tell people, they ask how I felt when I was there by myself. I felt great because after 4.5 days with those guys, it was nice to get rid of them for a while. But we did live in a volume that was about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle or a small Fiat, as you said, and so we had to learn how to accommodate each other. And what I remember of the flight was that basically we just stayed out of each other's way. I would sit in the left seat, which was the commander's seat, and I was in that seat all the flight, and except for the launch, which Dave sat there for the launch, and then I took over. And we kind of floated around and kind of kept to ourselves the experiments we had to do and the things we had to do together. We did, and we'd practiced all those things enough so that we were really quite good at them. But on the way out and on the way back, there wasn't that much to do that was really complicated. The complicated stuff came when I was in lunar orbit, when I had to operate the scientific instrument module with 2 large cameras and all the remote sensors and a mass spectrometer and a little sub-satellite we had. Those were all very complicated things. Dave and Jim in the lunar module went down and basically walked around. They had the lunar rover, of course, to give them more distance they could go, on the lunar surface. And their task was a little simpler than mine, I think, to pick up the rocks and take pictures and describe what they saw around them.
You and all the Apollo astronauts had to spend a ton of time preparing for all of your missions, and you had to meet some really hard deadlines. You were all engineers. You were all directly involved in both developing and testing the equipment, not to mention all the training you had to do to learn how to operate it.
Yeah.
So talk a bit about the teamwork and creativity that was occurring during this time at NASA.
Well, that was a wonderful time to be in NASA. Of course, we had our ups and downs. We lost a crew on Apollo 1 when they had to fire at the Cape. There was a committee that was put together. I was part of the reconstruction committee. And I spent the next year and a half basically at the manufacturer out in California. But there was, as I recall those days, there was no bureaucracy involved. We had this wonderful goal of putting a guy on the moon and bringing him back, and everybody focused on that goal. And so when problems came up, they were quickly solved because nobody was trying to protect their position. We're all just trying to get the job done. I think NASA is quite different today. I think bureaucracy has crept in, and so NASA is not the same today as it used to be. But back in those days, everybody was focused on the one goal of getting a guy on the moon. And things were not contentious. Well, there was a lot of contentious discussions trying to figure out the best way to do things because everybody had their own ideas. But the solutions were generally accomplished. There was a chairman of each of that committee, like the committee I was on to rebuild the spacecraft. The chairman was Frank Borman, and he'd listen to everybody very calmly and patiently, and then he'd make a decision. And that's the way we went. And it was all focused on getting a guy on the moon. Nobody was worried about their own position. So it was really quite an interesting scenario for a government agency to act that way. A good example of that is that we had our own T-38s. We had a fleet of T-38s we could fly around the country. And there was no question about going somewhere. If I wanted to go somewhere, I just called the flight line, and they'd have an airplane ready. No paperwork, no red tape, none of the complicated stuff that goes on today. Everybody had a job to do, and everybody was trusted to do that job, and I don't know of anybody that didn't do what they were supposed to do. So it was a really good management scheme to work under, and we had some really bright people and some people that really worked very hard to make sure that we were okay on the flight, that we did our job, and that everything was doable.
Your lives were totally engulfed by this for quite a number of years. What kind of toll did it take on your personal life?
Well, it took a toll. After I was assigned to the backup crew on Apollo 12, it got to the point where my family life kind of disappeared, and a divorce was in the offing, and so my wife divorced me because she couldn't handle the publicity, and she didn't like reporters snooping around the house, and she didn't like me flying in space. It just worried her, and so she thought she'd be better off on her own, so she left. And but it was interesting because we've remained good friends. We're still good friends. But at the time, my divorce was final the week before I was officially announced as part of the crew of Apollo 15. And that was because there was nothing, odd about my divorce or anything like that. It was just that she wanted to get away from it all. And Deke told me, he said, at the time, he said, I got, if you're going to get divorced, that's okay, but just, I don't want to see any write-ups in any of the scandal magazines about why you got a divorce. Well, none of that happened, and I got assigned to Apollo 15. I think I'm the only one in the program who did that. There were other guys who got divorced, but they did it, they held out until they'd made a flight. They wanted to make sure they got the flight in first because they were worried about getting kicked out of the program. And I felt that it was more important to settle that issue above anything else. And it turns out that Deke was okay with it, and I made the flight.
Yeah, you're talking about Deke Slayton, who kind of
he was the boss then.
Yeah, he was the boss of all the astronauts.
Right.
And you talk about your mission and the time it took and so on and so forth. But a fun part of your mission, and this is something that's unique to you because not only were you the first person, as you just said, to go ahead and take care of your home issues before you got assigned to a crew, you're also the first person that actually got out of the spacecraft in deep space, in between Earth and Moon, the first person to actually do a spacewalk outside of Earth orbit. And I think you were traveling about 2,000 miles an hour when you did that. So what was that like?
3,000 miles an hour, something like that. We were about 196,000 miles out. In that scientific instrument module that I had, which was an open bay in the service module, I had two large cameras. One was a high-resolution camera that had been the camera used on the U2 program back in the late 50s and early 60s, and we were able to carry that camera with us. And the other was a mapping camera that I used to map about 25% of the moon's surface. Those two film canisters had to come back inside the command module as the only way of getting them back through the atmosphere. So I had to go out and get them, and that was quite an event. It's kind of funny, Tony, because I didn't think about it all that much at the time because I had practiced it so many times that it was sort of like doing it by rote. I didn't have to think; I just went ahead and did it. So only when I after the flight and a couple of weeks later did I have an opportunity to really think about the fact that I did a spacewalk a couple 100,000 miles away from Earth. That's kind of unusual. And that was the first one. And, of course, I had to develop all the procedures that we used on that spacewalk so that Apollo 16 and 17 could do the same thing.
Well, and you had a unique perspective, right? I mean, when you got out, you could see both the entire Earth and both the entire Moon at the same time.
Oh, yeah. That was a perspective. I was kind of aware that would probably happen on the spacewalk, but when I actually saw it, it was wow. Here I am out in space. I mean, really in space, a couple 100,000 miles home from home, and I could see both home and the moon at the same time, and that was pretty impressive. I don't remember seeing many stars because the sun was out. When the sun is shining on you, you don't really see any stars, but I could certainly see the Earth and the moon, and it was a magnificent sight. I can't tell you how profound that felt to me at the time that I could do that. I guess the thing about the spacewalk was that when I was doing it, I didn't think about anything except just doing what I had to do. I wasn't thinking about the philosophical side of being outside that far away from home. So I did my job, and I was so well trained that I did it too fast. And I tried to figure out ways to stay out a little bit longer, but I couldn't figure out anything. And finally, Mission Control said, "Get back in. You've done the job." So I was only out there about 38 minutes, but it was enough for me to see both the Earth and the Moon at the same time.
Well, and you told me some of the funniest things. One of them was, Jim and Dave go down to the moon and they take 3,000 pictures of each other picking up rocks.
Yeah.
And then there was only one picture of you, and that was basically of your behind climbing out to the outside of the service module, which I thought was pretty funny.
Yeah, well, Jim was supposed to do a motion picture. We had a Maurer sequence camera on board that was a 16 frames a second kind of film camera, and he was supposed to stick that on a pole outside the hatch to the command module and record my whole EVA. Well, the thing jammed after I think the second frame or something, and so all you got was my rear end going out the hatch. And that's the only picture we got.
Well, that's your best view. Come on.
It's
your
my
best
view.
side.
I tell everybody, it's probably the best way to look at me.
All right, so Al, during the 60s, astronauts had a very cool reputation, meaning they were usually thought of as playboys who would hunt, fish, race cars. Mm-hmm. However, you chose to go on Mr. Rogers, a kids' television show, on a number of occasions. Why, and what did your fellow astronauts think about it?
Well, about a month before flight, I was made aware of the fact that children under 16 were not allowed on the Cape during a launch back in those days. And I thought that was kind of unfair because it's the kids that are our future, and they're the ones who really should be enjoying a launch and being amazed by it and seeing the wonder of it and, setting their sights on doing something similar when they grow up. So I thought it was kind of, it was really, really, really not good that they weren't allowed on the Cape. So I one day picked up the phone and called Sesame Street and talked to the producer. And we chatted for a while, and he said, "Call me back next week, and I'll let you know." And I called him back, and he said, "Well, we've talked about it, and even though July is a time when everybody's out doing commercials and summer stock and that kind of thing, they will take a break and come down and do a movie around your flight. But we want something in return." And I said, what is it you want to have in return? He said, "If you'll name the command module Big Bird, then we'll come down and do a movie." And I said, "I don't think so." So I hung up, and then I called Fred Rogers. And in the course of the conversation, he absolutely fell in with what I wanted to do. Thought it was a wonderful idea. He put me on hold, and while I was on hold, he was calling the NOVA crew up in Boston, which is probably the best mobile crew in the country, and made arrangements for them to come down to the Cape and spend a weekend down there filming. And it happened to be the weekend before I went in quarantine. It was the 4th of July, 1971. So we did that show. It was supposed to be part of a series, but when he looked at what he had when he got back to Pittsburgh, he decided to make a special out of it. So it was shown actually before my launch. But part of that was Fred and I talking in Launch Control Center. He had brought a list of questions that the kids had asked, and of course they were related to being in space. And I told Fred some of the questions I couldn't answer because I hadn't been there. I said, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take the questions with me, think about them during the flight, and then when I come back, maybe we can do another show and talk about them. So that's what started that. And I went to Pittsburgh, 2 or 3 times, 3 or 4 times maybe, taping shows with Fred. I think we did 10 altogether. All about space flight, like clothing and like food that we ate, and we'd actually get some of our freeze-dried food and reconstitute it and that kind of thing on his show. And I thought it was wonderful. Fred was a wonderful guy, and he's a good friend.
What did your fellow Apollo guys think about it?
Well, I was kind of laugh. I guess I'm the only one in the whole. Well, I think there are some guys who probably thought it was okay, but many of the astronauts, they're Type A guys. They're mostly fighter pilots, and they like to hunt and fish, and they wear big watches, and they eat candy bars, that kind of thing. And I think for a guy to do children's television was they thought was a little silly. So I got some laughs, and I got a little heckling about it. Not bad. They actually showed the special in crew quarters a couple of nights before my launch, and everybody watched it. And got a little kidding and a little ribbing about it. But I think everybody sort of felt like it was a kind of a good thing to do.
Okay, so when you were orbiting the moon, I know you're very, very busy. You're performing experiments. You were taking photos. You were doing all kinds of things. But I know you had some down times where you didn't have to do all that stuff, and I'm sure you had a moment or two where you could just stare out into the darkness of space out the window, especially on the backside of the moon. What did you see, and what did you think about?
Well, two things. One is I went around the moon 75 times. And, of course, every time, on every one of those revolutions, every orbit, I came around the side of the moon and I watched the Earth rise. And I got to a window and watched that every time because it's such a phenomenal sight from out there. It's small. It's pretty much covered with clouds, but you can see the continents and the oceans and all that. It's almost exactly like the old geography books that we used to study when we were kids. So I thought that was pretty wonderful. But then there was a portion of the orbit where I was shadowed from both the Earth and the Sun, total darkness, and I could see the universe out there. And that just absolutely blew my mind because turns out that we really can't extrapolate or forecast or even figure out philosophically what's out there because it's so much bigger than we ever thought. Every time we get a better telescope, we see further out and we see more stars. And I looked at the Milky Way from out there, and the Milky Way's got something like 400 billion stars in with a B. And then you find out that there are a couple 100 billion with a B constellations out there, and you say, and that's only as far as we can see. What would it be like if we could had another bigger telescope? So it makes you pretty humble, and it makes you realize that of all the trillions of stars that we can formulate out there, there are going to be a certain amount of them that are going to be planetary, and they're going to have an atmosphere, and they're going to be kind of like Earth, and there are probably going to be some people out there. So that's the other, philosophically, that's the other part of it, is that it opened the door to my mind to think, yeah, we're probably not alone out here. I think fundamentally we like to think of ourselves as the only ones in the universe, but I don't think that's true. I think there are other civilizations out there like us, probably much more advanced than we are.
It's really hard for me as an intelligent human being, it's hard for me to comprehend that or even think for a second that with this vastness of the universe, we are the only little tiny planet in all of it that has any life on it. That is a hard thing for me to swallow.
Well, yeah, and I think you have to look at even the factors that act here on Earth. What do people do when a natural disaster occurs close to them? They move to another place. And you can look at all kinds of tribes and all kinds of ancient history here on Earth, and you realize that people propagated outwards from a disaster and populated other places in the world. For instance, the South Pacific. I mean, it's a natural thing that the grand imperative of all things that are alive is to make sure that the species survives. And people here on Earth have done that. And I apply that same philosophy to the universe and say, it's got to be the same thing going on. We can't be any different than how we see biological life here on Earth. And we know at the same time that the time will come when the sun is going to turn into a red giant, and it's going to swallow up all the planets in the solar system, and we can't be here. We got to go somewhere else. And then I think, well, if that's the case, and there's another civilization that's a million years advanced on us, maybe they came here because they had the same problem. I don't know. I just have an open mind to that because I think survival of the species is such an ingrained genetic drive in all of us, and that maybe that is the motivating drive that is putting us into space because we're getting ready to go somewhere else. And it may be 1,000 years, could be 10,000 years, I don't know. But the time will come when we're going to be doing that. And I think that's a very natural, logical thing.
Okay, I've been known to ask all of my guests some of the same questions just to get a feel for how great minds actually think differently.
Oh, then you don't want to ask me?
Come on. So,
yeah. Okay.
So if you hadn't been a pilot or an astronaut, what would you have liked to have been?
If I hadn't run into college issues, I would have been a musician. I played piano and I took lessons all the time until I went off to college. And I wanted to be a pianist And in fact, my first year in college before I went to West Point was kind of in the music school. But then when I went to West Point, that changed. There's not much music at West Point. But I realized that I had to be flexible and follow my dreams, and that's what I did. So I kind of switched from music to West Point, the military, but more as a technical side than anything else, because when I went into the Air Force, it was I did a lot of technical stuff, and I went back to graduate school to learn all the technical things like aerospace, aeronautics, and instrumentation. So I had a goal of being a test pilot, but I was kind of flexible in how I got there. But I knew where I wanted to go.
Okay, so I got to ask, Al, are you sitting in an airport right now? I'm hearing lots of planes. I mean, I know you're a pilot and all, but I mean,
no, I'm only a mile off the end of the runway of Vero Beach Airport, and I'm sitting on the back porch.
Ah, there you go. Okay,
well, there we are. So you can hear that in the background.
I can hear the planes.
Drool a little bit because I'm watching them go.
There you go. So, what would you definitely not want to do?
What would I definitely not want to do?
Yep.
Boy, that's a good question. There isn't anything I wouldn't want to do. I can't think of anything. I love everything. I like the technical stuff. I'm getting back into music a little bit, and I'm writing some more books. I have a pretty full life, my friend.
Well, that you do, because I've watched it firsthand.
Yep.
Okay, so imagination and creativity were obviously huge aspects of the Apollo program, especially especially since most of the math, the science, the technology had to be created from scratch. How did you or others in the program stay creative? I mean, do you know of any particular secrets or tricks they used to use?
No, I don't think there are any tricks. I think it's all depends on the individual. I had to be fairly creative with how I did the spacewalk on the way home. Because there were some technical methods to recover the film canisters from the scientific instrument module, which I did not like. So I did, I just thought about it, and I thought, there's got to be a better way to do it. Let's think outside the box. They had this endless clothesline, and they wanted the canisters to come back on this endless clothesline. I said, that's not going to work in space because there's absolutely no way to retard the motion of that canister if it starts swinging in space. And they tried it in a water tank, and of course it works well there because the water tank dampened everything. And so we tried it, and we found that it didn't work. So in thinking about it, I said, what's the simplest way we can do it? And I think creativity sometimes is finding the simplest way of doing things, not being so overly technical that you make it complicated. So I said, well, why don't I just go out and grab the canister with my hand and just take it back? And the upshot of that was that that's what we did, except that I had to have a little safety tether on my wrist connected to the canister in case I let go of it. But outside of that, it was a very simple thing. Go out there, grab the canister, and take it back. I think that was being a little creative, and I think it was something that nobody had thought of. Okay, so
I do this with all my guests. It's time for the lightning round. So I'm going to ask you some either-ors. I'm going to tell you a couple things, and you need to, just off the top of your head, pick the one that resonates the most with you. Okay?
Okay.
Ready?
Mm-hmm.
Phone call or text message?
Text.
Sunrise or sunset?
Sunset.
Television shows or movies?
Movies.
Facebook or Twitter?
Facebook.
Toilet paper, over or under?
Over.
Grilled or pan-fried?
Grilled.
High-tech or low-tech?
High-tech.
Nickelback or the Stones?
Nickelback.
Call of Duty or Pac-Man?
Call of Duty.
Sweet or salty?
Salty.
Star Trek or Star Wars?
Star Wars.
Oh, gosh, Al, you're killing me.
Yeah, wow.
All right, hey, listen, you grew up farming in Michigan. So,
yes.
So in simple terms, how did you get here?
I decided that I was not going to spend my life on a farm. I had to go do something. I was technically or mathematically what do I want to say, empowered. So I knew I had to go into a technical era, even though until I went to West Point, I was more into music. But music is a mathematical thing too. So I did the sort of the math side of things, realizing that was my kind of thing, and I just worked my way along. I've got 8 years of college, and my parents haven't paid for any of it. I did it all by myself, and I think anybody could do that. But I think you have to have a goal, and I think you have to work your butt off to get there. And you can't take no for an answer, and you can't stop, and you can't slow down. You just got to keep forging ahead and do what you got to do. Take the good with the bad, the lumps with the good part, and just keep trudging forward, and you get where you want to be sooner or later.
Do you ever feel as if you were lucky?
Yeah, I think everything is lucky. Yeah, I think from a professional standpoint, I was very lucky. Maybe from a personal standpoint, since my wife couldn't handle what I was doing when I got in the program, that was unlucky. Maybe, I don't know. But things always turn out the way they're going to. Things always happen for the best. And now my ex-wife and I are still good friends. So even that was not as bad as I thought it was at the time.
You know, I always define luck as a fortuitous, unplanned opportunity because... Well,
I think that's what it is. And, but luck also implies a lot of hard work and a lot of background and a lot of learning on your part. And then when things happen, people say, "Oh boy, you're lucky," and you say, "Yeah, I'm lucky, but look what I did to get here."
Yeah, and that's the point. What defines people who are lucky versus unlucky, in my opinion, is people are surrounded by luck all the time. The problem is they didn't put themselves in a position where they could take advantage of it.
That's correct. They weren't prepared to take advantage of it.
Right, and you did, obviously, all throughout your career. So, hey, Al, I want to thank you for taking the time you spent with me today. Let me end the show by asking this. There are those people out there that, despite the overwhelming amount of evidence that we have that we have been to and walked on the moon, such as the orbital photographs of the base of the LEM still sitting there, surrounded by tire tracks in the dirt that's by the lunar rover that's still there, parked next to it. How do you respond to those people who think this is all some kind of an elaborate hoax?
Well, I think there are a lot of ways to respond to that, outside of just calling them idiots. But I think my response to that usually is something like this: there were 500,000 people that worked on the excuse me. There were 500,000 people that worked on the program, and there is no way in the world you can pay off that many people to lie about it.
Yeah, see, my response to that has always been kind of like, well, anything elaborate from a hoax-wise in history, it's hard to keep a lot of people's mouths quiet. And,
sure.
And if you're going to go to all the trouble to do this kind of an elaborate hoax, why would you then repeat it 6 more times?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, which makes no sense to me at all. But, it's funny how people out there, despite the evidence, and I'm not even sure why people will even struggle with the fact that we couldn't have done it, because, I mean, look at what we're doing today. The technology has changed, and it shouldn't be that hard to comprehend today from people. Hey, Al, thanks again for your time. You had an amazing experience that only a few other people got to share. 20 others, as a matter of fact, to be specific. I also would like to encourage everyone who has been listening to get a copy of your book, Falling to Earth. It's a great read and even greater story. And thank all of you for listening and taking a step beyond with us. The Apollo program, in my opinion, is one of, if not the greatest examples of orchestrated creativity and applied imagination. It shows that with enough effort and resources, almost anything, and I mean anything, is possible. There are thousands of products and innovations today that we take for granted that came directly out of the research created for Apollo. And by some estimates, the economic return on investment is as high as 15-1. I challenge anyone to find another return like this, especially in the public sector. And if you do find one, please give me a call, because I'll be all in on it. I believe Al's story, a story where imagination and creativity are combined with passion and hard work, is the recipe for greatness. I hope you'll continue to listen to A Step Beyond and become inspired to be the very best version of yourself. I'm your host, Anthony Postian. Follow your dreams.
Thanks for listening to A Step Beyond. Take a moment, if you would, and leave a review on iTunes and share the podcast with those who need to be inspired to become more creative and imaginative in everything they do.